Hello guys, right now we're going to look at chapter 5, reasons for Germany's defeat in World War II. Okay, so essentially chapter 4 was about the outbreak of World War II in Europe, how World War II came about. So right now we're going to focus on how it came to an end, and the focus will be on Europe itself. So essentially that culminated with the defeat of Germany, okay, within Europe itself. So firstly we're going to look at some background. Basically we're going to look at some background. We're going to look at three main factors which caused Germany's defeat. So firstly, American entry into World War II. Secondly, German weaknesses and miscalculations, because in order for them to be defeated, the enemy had to be strong, and the Germans themselves had to have certain weaknesses within their own ranks. And finally, Allied resistance as well. So essentially, the roles of the USSR and the role of Britain, and also the roles of the resistance fighters that fought in Europe. Okay, so firstly, we're going to start with some background. Okay, okay, so firstly, we're going to look at the Allies. Okay, so essentially World War II in Europe was between the Allies, Britain and France. Okay, France basically fell to Germany by June 1940. Okay, they were overrun, and basically most of France was taken over by the Germans. Okay, and the USA joined the side of the Allies from 1941. We'll find out why later on. And the USSR basically became part of the Allied forces in 1941, basically when Germany invaded the USSR, breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact. Okay, if you remember the Nazi-Soviet pact. Okay, so these are the main allies, okay, main powers that fought for the Allies. Secondly, we're going to look at the Axis powers, which were basically the enemy of the Allies. Okay, essentially it comprised fascist Italy under Mussolini, Japan, okay, under Emperor Hirohito, basically which fought mainly in the Asia Pacific area, and finally Germany under Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany. Okay, so it's essentially the Allies versus the Axis powers. I think this should be very clear and familiar to all of you. Okay, and there were early German victories, so essentially the Germans got off to a very good start. However, these early victories didn't last for too long, and we'll find out why later on. And eventually, Germany was defeated in 1945, bringing the war in Europe to a close. Okay, so this is just some background of World War II, essentially. Okay, so okay, I can close this. Okay, right now we get to the first factor which proved to be very important to Germany's defeat. So when you think of the American entry into World War II, okay, you need to think very carefully, and you need to be able to link very clearly how the American entry contributed to Germany's defeat. It's not enough to be able to describe what America did, but you need to basically link what America did to how it led Germany to its eventual defeat. Okay, so we're going to look at a few things that America did. So some background, you must be wondering why America only joined the war in 1941, although, as we know, the outbreak of World War II in Europe officially began with the German invasion of Poland in 1939. Okay, so it was about 2 years later that the Americans entered World War II on the side of the Allies. So some background over here. Okay, essentially, America, because of things like the Great Depression, because of the horrors of World War One, they pursued this policy of isolationism. So they isolated themselves from Europe. They didn't want to get involved in issues in Europe, and basically in another foreign war. Okay, they didn't want to get involved. Okay, and in 1937, this thing called the Neutrality Act was passed, and essentially this act basically pledged that America would stay out of foreign wars. So it assured the American people that America itself will not be involved in foreign wars, and in extension, okay, wars in Europe. Okay, so this is just some background. Okay, so essentially America was out of it. So even when the Germans invaded Poland, America was the isolationist sentiment in America was still relatively strong. Okay, so initially, what America did was to um, have some indirect involvement. So essentially, indirect means they were not in the war itself. Okay, they helped in other ways short of war. Okay, so firstly, there was this thing called the cash and carry basis. So even though the Neutrality Act was signed 2 years later, the Americans decided that they could sell arms to countries like Britain and France on a cash and carry basis. So essentially, what cash and carry meant was that the British and French, people like that who wanted to buy arms from America, they had to pay up front, okay, pay in cash up front to get the weapons, and they also had to carry their own weapons back to Europe. So basically, Americans would not settle transportation for them. Okay, but as the war became more intensive, and as the Americans saw that the Germans, the fascists, they were gaining the advantage in Europe, they revised this cash and carry policy to become this Lend-Lease Act. So cash and carry changed to Lend-Lease about 2 years later in 1941. So essentially what Lend-Lease did was to provide food, weapons and equipment to countries like Britain and later on to the USSR as well. Basically, compared to the cash and carry policy, the Lend-Lease Act was a lot more generous. Basically, the British and the USSR, they did not need to pay upfront. They could actually borrow, okay, these resources. Okay, they didn't have to pay upfront, and the USA was willing to provide transport of these goods over to the recipients. Okay, so it's a much more generous policy than the cash and carry policy. Okay, and this basically, how did this help to contribute to Germany's defeat? Basically, it provided a fresh injection of supplies, okay, things like food, weapons, and equipment. They were very, very important to a country like Britain, which by June 1940 was the only European country left standing in Western Europe. They were basically fighting the Germans on their own. So the fresh injection of supplies allowed the Allies in Europe itself to sustain the war effort and eventually defeat Germany. Okay, so basically these items helped them to keep fighting, because without them, basically the war effort would have been in vain. They would have had to surrender because they didn't have enough resources. So these resources kept the British going and also kept the Soviet Union going to basically sustain the war effort against the Germans even before the Americans entered the war. So these basically was very, very important, okay, to the Allied powers. And also Germany, unlike Britain, unlike the USSR, did not have a strong ally like the USA, okay, to receive such help, which placed it at a disadvantage. So while the British and the USSR were enjoying the resources provided by a great industrial power like the USA, Germany didn't get to enjoy such privileges. Okay, because Italy and Japan, they were equally short of resources like that. Okay, as you will look at in chapter 7 later on. Okay, so basically the keyword here: sustain war effort and eventually defeat Germany. Okay, resources are of paramount importance to fighting the war. Okay, so I'm going to close this now. Okay, another way that America was indirectly involved was through this thing called the arsenal of democracy. Basically, an arsenal is a place where weapons are kept. Okay, so arsenal of democracy basically means that the USA was there to stand up for democracy, which was basically helping democratic countries like Britain fight against undemocratic countries like Nazi Germany. Okay, so what Roosevelt, was the president of the USA at that time, he felt that the USA should be an arsenal of democracy, and they should provide all support possible to the Allies to fight against undemocratic powers like Italy, Germany, okay, short of going to war with these countries. So basically, the USA pledged to provide military aid to Britain and therefore forged stronger bonds with Britain. So Churchill and Roosevelt, Churchill was the leader of Britain, forged very, very close relationship with Roosevelt, okay, of America. And what happens was that in addition to providing aid to Britain, there were also plans to expand the American military, basically prepare for a possible war, and also to increase the rate of rearmament in America. So basically, what you see as a reverse of the policy of isolationism. Okay, and what the Arsenal of Democracy did was to provide the allies, like the British, with strong psychological and material support. Okay, and basically help to boost Allied morale. And the material support, okay, things like Lend-Lease, they basically gave the Allies military superiority in the long run because unlike the Germans, they were provided with fresh injections like we looked at when we looked at the Lend-Lease Act. Okay, so the psychological and material support helped them to also sustain the war against Germany, which allowed them to eventually turn the tide and defeat Germany. Okay, so and the USA also provided other forms of aid. So, for example, escort roles. The U.S. Navy protected Allied convoys, okay, especially convoys holding on to supplies from America itself, from the German Navy, so they could safely carry these supplies across the Atlantic and to Europe, where these supplies were needed. Also, the USA imposed economic sanctions on countries, the Allied Axis countries, sorry. So, for example, they restricted the export of important war resources like iron to the Axis powers. And what happened was that the Axis powers were weakened due to the lack of resources. Like I said, countries like Germany, countries like Japan, were weakened due to the lack of resources. And therefore, the Allies, who could rely on the USA, had a material advantage over the Axis powers. And this eventually led to German defeat. Like I said, resources are key to sustaining the war effort. So if you have sufficient supply of resources, you can eventually defeat the enemy. So in this case, the Germans. Okay, and also Japan's assets in the USA were frozen after the invasion of Indochina. So basically, another way that the USA was showing that it was in support of the Allied powers. Although this, in a way, was not directly linked to the German performance in Europe. Okay, right now I'm going to look at direct involvement. So some background. Why on earth did the USA, from pursuing a policy of isolationism, suddenly get directly involved, send its troops, its tanks, everything into Europe itself? Basically, Pearl Harbor, 1941. As we all know, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii against the American Pacific Fleet. And what happened was that the Americans, being angry with the Japanese, declared war on Japan. And because Hitler and Germany were Japan's allies, they had no choice but to declare war on the USA, which had already declared war against Japan. Okay, so now that it was directly involved, it could contribute manpower and resources. So essentially, the USA was the largest industrial economy, and what it was able to do was to convert its own factories producing cars, for example, to produce military resources. So a lot of car factories, they were converted into tank factories, weapon factories, for example. And therefore, not the Allies, but the Axis simply couldn't keep up with the amount of resources that were being churned out by America. Okay, so America was basically producing tanks, producing planes at a faster rate that the Germans could have ever hoped for. And also there was I'm going to just leave this open. A large amount of military aid was provided. For example, 11 million American soldiers were sent abroad to fight World War II against the Axis powers. And when you compare this to Britain, which was itself under attack, which only had 4.5 million troops, this actually 11 million represented a tremendously significant amount of manpower on the side of the Allies. Okay, and what kind of impact did the contribution of manpower and resources have? Essentially, the troops and resources boosted the Allied war effort, and this is especially significant when you compare it to the drained and war-weary German military, which suffered. The longer the war dragged on, the more unlikely the Germans looked like winning the war, simply because they couldn't keep up militarily, they couldn't keep up in terms of resources as well. And what happened was that US contribution of manpower and resources basically greatly increased the advantage of the Allies over the Axis powers, and this eventually led to German defeat. Okay, and next up, there was also a collaboration with allies on strategies. So, for example, the USA and the Allies worked out certain strategies to defeat Germany. So what happened was that bomb attacks, especially from American planes, were launched on German cities and military sites. And this slowed down war production, again making Germany be placed at a disadvantage when we talk about resources, okay, and therefore the German military readiness was affected. Okay, so basically it couldn't sustain its war effort simply because it couldn't match the material military production. And also the US used its strategic bases together with the other allied powers to gain control of the sea. Okay, so basically the sea, the ocean between Europe and America was the Atlantic Ocean. So basically when you have strategic bases in the Atlantic Ocean, you can basically gain control of the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, which allows a very smooth transportation from the USA over to Europe. Okay, so what kind of impact did this have? Basically, the efforts caused Germany to lose control of air and sea simply because they were simply outdone in terms of the air forces and also their navy. And so it was very hard for resources to reach Germany. Okay, simply because the Allies had gained control of the air and the sea. So very hard for resources to reach Germany, and if resources couldn't reach Germany, basically their war effort and the military readiness would have been adversely affected. And therefore they were able to launch the D-Day landings of 1944, which eventually led to German defeat. So let's look at the D-Day landings, for example. Okay, so if you look over here, okay, look carefully. Basically what happened during the D-Day landings in 1944 was that, okay, over here on this side you have the Atlantic Ocean, and over to the left, that's America. So what happened is that Americans together with the British launched basically a D-Day landings, and D-Day landings happened, okay, from here to here, places in Normandy, which was in northern France. So the British, the Americans, they sent their allied forces. They landed over here, okay, basically defeating the German defenses over here. And once the allied troops could land here, you realize that basically the red parts represent places under the control of the Nazis, whereas blue were basically controlled by the Allies. So you realize that most of Europe were under Nazi control. So what happened was that when the D-Day landings happened, basically the Allied forces landed on continental Europe and started to turn the tide. So from then on, from the D-Day landings onwards, what happened is that there will be an increasing blue area, which means that the war had turned its tide basically. So it allowed them to reverse German gains. So from here, basically you'll find that it slowly decrease. Okay, the red would decrease and the blue would increase again. Okay, so this was basically the results of the D-Day landings in 1944, which was made possible only because the Allies had control of the sea and of the air, which allowed them to successfully land their troops over here in Normandy. Okay? Alright, and this eventually led to German defeat. Okay, so so be very familiar with indirect involvement, essentially before 1940, before Pearl Harbor, and direct involvement after Pearl Harbor, when after Hitler had to declare war on the USA. Okay, we now move on to our next part, which is in addition to the USA being very strong, the Germans had their own issues, their own problems. So let's look at a few of them. So firstly, the Germans had an ineffective command structure. Okay, there was a problem of overlapping authority. It means different people were giving different instructions about the same thing, and that made decision making very difficult. So let's look at some of the problems. Firstly, there's a confusion in decision-making process. Like I said, when you have a lot of people telling everyone to do different things, there's basically massive confusion. And what happened was that Hitler was particularly guilty of it. This guy, Hitler, he was just a corporal, remember, in World War One, not a very high-ranking soldier. But what he did was that as Führer, he was overruling his more experienced generals, guys who had fought in World War One, who were officers in World War One. So, for example, basically there are two main battles that we look at. Okay, basically the Battle of Britain over here, and secondly the Battle for Moscow. Okay, Moscow, which was in USSR. Basically, these two areas saw Hitler make certain mistakes that proved to be really, really costly. Okay, so what happened was that in the Battle of Britain in 1940, Hitler, basically the German Luftwaffe, the German air forces, were basically battling the RAF, which was the Royal Air Forces under the British. So basically mainly an air battle. The Germans gained the upper hand, but halfway through, Hitler said that we should attack the cities, because if we attack the cities, basically a lot of people will die, and when people die in the cities, morale will go down for Britain, and therefore give us the advantage. However, what happened was that while Hitler diverted his air forces to attack the cities, and when they left the RAF alone, it allowed the RAF to recover, to rebuild, and basically to come back as strong as, or even stronger than before. And this basically prevented Britain as a whole from falling, because Britain continued to enjoy air support from the Royal Air Forces, which basically kept Britain from falling into German hands. Okay, so big mistake by Hitler. Hitler thought that he would gain a bigger advantage by attacking the cities, but as he did that, he basically allowed the RAF to recover instead of completely wiping out the RAF, which would have left Britain in grave danger. Okay, next up, the invasion of the USSR. So basically Hitler he made a few orders in troop deployment for the Battle of Moscow. Basically the German troops were very close to overrunning Moscow, to conquering Moscow, which was the capital of the USSR. So very, very important place is where all the important Soviet leaders were, in Moscow. But what happened was that as the battle dragged on a little bit, Hitler thought that let's attack Ukraine, because we can get resources like oil from the Ukraine. So he diverted forces, instead of concentrating there on Moscow, to go and fight in the Ukraine. So basically the troops left to fight for Moscow were reduced, and basically eventually they failed to take over Moscow, which would have been a massive victory for the Germans if they had just concentrated on attacking Moscow. So again, another problem. And what happened was that although the Soviets were taken by surprise, and the Germans essentially wanted to defeat the Soviets as soon as possible, what happened was that the Germans were prevented from winning a quick and decisive victory. And again, the war dragged on for way longer and the Germans were prepared for, and eventually led to a disaster for the Germans on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Okay, so basically the Battle of Britain, Hitler made a mistake in basically diverting his air force to attack the cities instead of destroying the RAF, and the invasion of USSR basically instead of concentrating on Moscow, diverted his resources to other places like the Ukraine, for example, which basically lengthened the war on the Eastern Front. And as we know, if you don't defeat Britain, you'll continue needing resources to fight against Britain, which was on the Western Front, and now the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. So eventually, the Germans didn't have the resources to cope with fighting on two fronts, which we will talk about later on. Okay, so these were grave mistakes because they basically prolonged the war, and remember, the Germans could not afford to fight a prolonged war. Okay, so we're going to look at the impact of this ineffective command structure. So the inability to defeat Britain and the USSR meant that Germany was drained of its resources and suffered great military losses. They lost so many men on the Eastern Front, for example. And this didn't allow them to sustain the war effort, which led to Germany's eventual defeat. Okay, secondly, we're going to look at inappropriate use of funds and resources. Firstly, there was ineffective military tactics. So what happened was that the Army, Navy, Air Force, they competed for limited funds. Remember, the Germans really had limited funds and resources. So instead of cooperating, these three main parts of the military were competing to see who can get the most amount of money, for example. So what happened was that there was a tremendous lack of coordination, and the funds were therefore not used wisely. So the funds were really limited, and yet they were not used wisely. So this really weakened the German war effort. Also, there was inefficient armaments production. What happened was that Germany relied a lot on slave labor, a lot of prisoners of war, Jewish prisoners, for example, to work in the factories, for example, to build armaments. And women, of course, unlike in Russia, they were discouraged from working. Remember, they were supposed to only be in charge of KKK, church, kitchen, and children. Basically, being good wives and good mothers. So they were discouraged from working. So basically, there was not enough workers in the factories, in the armament production factories. And when you don't have enough workers, you don't have enough armaments. And this really weakened the German war effort and added to the problem of being unable to sustain its war effort, which led to its eventual defeat. The Germans produced a variety of weapons. So when you produce so many weapons, you will need so many different kinds of spare parts to repair the weapons. And the Allies, they basically produced a few kinds of weapons, and this was very easy because they didn't need to produce so many different kinds of spare parts. So the Germans, having to produce so many different kinds of spare parts, found it very ineffective, inefficient, and very expensive to produce so many kinds of spare parts. And this again weakened their war effort. And there was also a shortage of proven weapons and essential equipment. Okay, what happened was that Hitler, he wanted the most up-to-date weapons. Remember the V2 missiles? Yeah. And basically, sometimes after a weapon was invented very quickly, even before it's properly tested, they were quickly used on the battlefield. So sometimes they didn't work as well as planned. So basically, this really affected the German war effort. There was also a shortage of trucks, basically important for transportation, infantry vehicles, and suitable clothing, especially winter clothing. And this really handicapped the German effort, especially when we talk about them fighting in the bitter winters of Russia. Okay, they couldn't sustain the effort. There are a lot of German soldiers actually froze while fighting against the Russians. Okay, so again, it hampered their war effort. So what kind of impact was that? The Allied resources had already exceeded that of Germany because the USA and the USSR had joined the Allied forces, and therefore, if you combine all the Allied resources, they had already enjoyed more resources than Germany. And basically, the German weakness was worsened by this poor allocation of funds and resources and this competition as well. And what happened was that Germany was placed at a massive disadvantage and therefore couldn't sustain its war effort, which led to its eventual defeat. Okay, so again, we think about the Allies being able to sustain the war effort, but the Germans, on the other hand, were not as capable as the Allies in sustaining the war effort, which led to its eventual defeat. Okay, the third problem with Germany was that it relied too much on petroleum. It lacked sufficient petroleum reserves. Petroleum was important for the factories, important to run things like tanks, ships, planes. Okay, essentially petroleum drove the German war effort. So because they lacked sufficient petroleum reserves, Germany invented this synthetic oil as a substitute to normal petroleum. And however, the USA bombed both oil fields, okay, with petroleum and also the synthetic oil plants. Okay, what happened was that basically due to its reliance on petroleum, German military effectiveness was very vulnerable. So if the US targeted this petroleum and targeted the synthetic oil plants, what happened was that petrol supplies were basically cut, and this weakened Germany tremendously. And therefore, again, Germany couldn't sustain its war effort, which led to its eventual defeat. Because if you have no oil, things like military production and also the execution of war itself would have been affected, severely affected. Okay, and finally, fighting on two fronts. Basically, the two fronts we're referring to are the Western Front against countries like Britain, against the USA on the western side. So if I show you the map again, okay, realize this was if this was Germany, okay, the Western Front will be on this side, and the Eastern Front will be on this side. Okay. So basically, they remember in violation of Nazi-Soviet pact, Hitler invaded the USSR. At the same time, it was still fighting countries like Britain, but yet it decided to invade the USSR, which was very problematic because then later on they declared war on the USA. So the two quite powerful countries, were suddenly at war with Germany. And Hitler thought that the USA would focus on Japan, since it was Japan which attacked Pearl Harbor. But unfortunately for Hitler, Roosevelt and his generals basically decided to adopt a Europe first policy. So the priority was given to defeating Hitler in Europe itself, okay, to Hitler's unhappiness, okay. And the impact of fighting on two fronts was basically that they had to fight two powerful enemies on two fronts, and they couldn't handle it because the resources were strained. Like I said, the Allied resources were basically a lot more than what Germany had. So the resources were strained, and then it led to its eventual defeat. Basically, it could not fight on two fronts. And Hitler knew that initially when he signed the Nazi-Soviet pact. But having invaded the USSR, he actually opened the second front, and basically it really stretched German resources. Alright. So these are the four main areas for German weaknesses and miscalculations. Okay, finally, we look at Allied resistance, and of course, in addition to America being involved, we have the USSR after it was attacked. So initially it was unprepared. Remember, it signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, which pledged neutrality to one another. They were initially unprepared. They suffered great losses in the beginning because they really were not prepared for the German attack. And however, the USSR soon gained the upper hand. So the longer the war dragged on, the USSR was able to recover. So let's see. So German tactical errors, like I mentioned in Moscow, for example, allowed the Russians to recover. And resistance of Soviet forces were also very, very stiff, very good, and the Germans were actually not expecting such firm resistance from the Soviet forces. Also, the harsh winters. The Germans did not expect to be fighting in the harsh winter Okay, they thought that the war would be they'll get it over and done with very quickly, but the harsh winters kicked in, and of course the Soviets were more accustomed to fighting the harsh winters than the Germans. So basically, the Germans were at a massive disadvantage, and these issues allowed the USSR to reorganize and rebuild. Okay, so Stalin could move his industrial plants east. Okay, and also the Lend-Lease Aid from America helped the USSR sustain its war effort to reorganize and to rebuild, and eventually turn the tide of war against the Germans. Okay, so basically by 1943, the Germans were on the back foot when we look at the Eastern Front. Okay, so for example, from 1943, like I said, the Battle of Kursk, the famous tank battle, basically that really put, from then on, it was retreat on the part of the Germans. Okay, so basically the tide of war was turned after, from 1943, which led to the eventual German defeat. So Germany had to retreat, and finally even go back to Berlin itself. So basically, okay, that's how the USSR contributed to German defeat. Right now, Britain also, remember Britain was the only country standing. If we look at the map again, the only country standing, okay, its neighbor France had already fallen, so it had to put up a very good fight, because look, it's relatively small, right, compared to the rest of the German territory, okay, territory under German rule. Okay, so what happened was that Hitler wanted to discuss peace terms with Britain to stop fighting with Britain, but Britain didn't trust them, especially when they were under Hitler and under Churchill, and Churchill hated and really couldn't stand Hitler. And what happened was that Hitler's errors, like I said, during the Battle of Britain, gave the British time to recover, and although the Germans thought that as we attack the cities, people's morale will go down, actually it improved the British morale, made them want to fight even harder, improved the fighting spirit of the British, so it had the opposite effect. And the impact was that the British continued to resist effectively, and the longer the British could resist, basically, the more it drained German war resources and later contributed to its eventual defeat. Okay, and when America came to the picture to support the British, I think, it was basically very, very disadvantageous for the Germans. Okay, finally we're going to look at resistance movements. So, for example, so I forgot to show you this. So, there's Churchill says, "We shall never surrender." So, this really embodies the fighting spirit of the British during this period of time. And I'm going to show you one picture over here. Okay, what you see in this picture over here are basically German soldiers who have surrendered. Over here, these are French resistance fighters, okay, from the underground. Okay, and over here, this guy is an Allied soldier. So you see the French resistance fighters fighting alongside the Allied soldiers against the Germans. Okay, so what happens with the resistance movements? They played a very, very important part in defeating Germany. So one of the things they did was to provide important information and support to the Allies. So basically important information that will help the Allies plan and also support. Okay, things we're going to look at that soon. So basically the kind of support was gathering intelligence for the Allies, giving them good information so the Allies know, for example, when and where to attack. They also launched sabotage operations against the Nazis. For example, they would launch ambushes. They would also, for example, plant bombs in certain bases, certain production plants, and they will also spread false intelligence to the Nazis. So give the Allies good intelligence, but spread false intelligence to the Nazis, to mislead the Nazis, make them go the wrong way, plan wrongly, and basically this was disastrous for the Nazi war effort. So the resistance movements, because they were there, the Nazis had to tackle them. So this further drained German resources. Okay, because resources were channeled to dealing with these resistance movements. You had the French resistance, you had the Eastern European resistance in forms of, for example, the Polish, underground Polish communists. A lot of people fought underground against the Germans, and as the Germans concentrated also resources on fighting the resistance movement, it stretched the resources and weakened its war effort. It was really fighting the USSR, Britain, and the USA, and now it had to contend with these resistance movements, and this further weakened the war effort of the Germans, which led to its eventual defeat. Alright, so when we look at Allied resistance, okay, remember that it's essentially the role of the USSR, Britain, and resistance movements. Okay, so just to sum up, remember that the three main areas you look at is USA's entry into war, focus on indirect involvement and direct involvement, know the difference, and also remember how Germany was weak, what kind of miscalculations people like Hitler made, and finally look at Allied resistance, okay, the role of the British, the Soviets, and the role of resistance movements. Alright, okay, thank you.